Hey girls and gals, welcome back to my channel. My name is Taylor and today's video is going to be my February reading wrap up. Now, in the month of February, I ended up reading 11 books and I did have a 12th book that I got about 50% of the way into and DNF'd, so 11 and a half books in the month of February, which is great. I do divide my wrap ups into two different segments, so my mid-month wrap up for February is already up. I will leave it down below. In that wrap up, I did talk about The Bone Shard Daughter by Andrea Stewart, They Never Learn by Lane Fargo, The Mime Order by Samantha Shannon, Gods of Jade and Shadow by Sylvia Moreno Garcia, Dolores Claiborne by Stephen King, Remote Control by Nydia Okorafor, and Honey Girl by Morgan Rogers. So if you want to see any of my in-depth thoughts about any of those books, definitely check out the link down below, but I'm going to be focusing on the rest of the books that I completed this month, which is still a substantial amount, so I've got 4 books to talk about and then my DNF as well. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and get started. The first book I'm going to talk about is my nonfiction book that I read these past 2 weeks, and that is going to be Laziness Does Not Exist by Devon Price, PhD. So this book focuses on our society and the myth that kind of laziness exists, and focuses on not only looking at like the puritanical roots of this laziness lie, laziness myth, and then also examining how we can confront it in our own life to kind of fix the way that we move about the world. So this talks about how modern day humans really work harder and longer than any other humans in history, at least as a whole, and if we're not actually working at like our 9-to-5 jobs or whatever, we have struggles kind of turning our brains off, and there's always like anxieties and pressures put upon us from society to do more, to hustle more, hustle harder, picking up, you know, side hustles and trying to monetize all of our hobbies, and just always feeling like if you are taking time for yourself, that's like guilty pleasure time. So this book really confronts kind of that. This book also came out this year, so it was very up to date, especially in like social sciences and things like that. I really appreciate when they're newer releases, because that means the science and everything is up to date. And this actually had some talking about the pandemic as well, how in March of last year, when we all had this time where we thought we were just gonna have 2 weeks off, there was this push when it started to become longer than that to really pick up hobbies, to try and monetize things, to make other incomes, to pick up jobs, to really just be productive, when all we should have been doing during a pandemic, at least at the very beginning of it, is just relaxing and surviving. And so if you're just surviving this pandemic, you're doing great. You don't need to thrive. It's a very scary, difficult time, and your brain and society doesn't need to push you to do the most. This book really has you examining on whether or not, you know, you could work maybe 90 hours a week and get more money, but if you scale it back to like 40 hours a week, sure, you're going to make less money, but perhaps, you know, the stress that's removed and the time that you are at work working, your life might actually improve a little bit if you can work on that. And then also it's a very large scale book, and I highly recommend you pick it up. And what I do like about this book is that it not only touches on, I mean, there is a certain privilege in being able to say that, you know, you don't have to be working all the time, you need to relax and give your body some rest. Dr. Price acknowledges that they are in a position where they can set their own hours, they can set their own boundaries for work, but it does also talk about if you are someone who works in food service or retail, how you can try and work with your colleagues and also your boss and yourself to set those boundaries, especially in places where you feel like you might not have a lot of agency. Making sure to really set boundaries for yourself, especially in the age of technology where you can be reached at all times. You don't need to be reached by your boss at all times. There are times where if you are at home, you don't need to be connected to work and always working on things. So yeah, I really enjoyed this one. We're coming up 1 year in this pandemic, so especially I felt like it was a really good time for me to read this, and I really enjoyed it. I did listen to the audiobook. I listened to it on Scribd, and I do highly enjoy it. It is one where the author narrates it, so I really enjoy that, especially in a nonfiction. I feel like it's easier for me to retain the information, so highly recommend that if you're looking for a good nonfiction. Now, moving on to my DNF, and I don't normally talk about DNFs during my wrap-ups because I usually am pretty good at DNFing a book if I am not enjoying enjoying a book, I can tell that pretty early on, and I really don't have any problems DNFing it because life is simply too short. However, this book, I really gave it a try, and I'm honestly really disappointed that it didn't work. And caveat, I have the first book in the series. I'm just going to be holding it up, but I was reading the second book in this series now as the DNF. So I did DNF The Fires of Vengeance by Evan Winter, the second book in the Burning series. So what I have right here is The Rage of Dragons. I read this last year. I did enjoy it, and I did have some issues with it, but I liked the writing style enough and thought it was an interesting enough story where I felt like a lot of my issues could be resolved in a second or third installation. So I tried the audiobook actually of the second book, and I highly recommend that actually. I thought the audiobook narrator was wonderful and really helped me delve into the story and the world and the characters a lot more immediately than I was able. I felt like this one was really hard to dive into and get connected with the characters. The second book improves on that. The second book also improves on, I really hated how there were, for what is supposed to be a matriarchal society, no women in this book at all, and if they are there, they're very stereotypically not fleshed out at all. And there are some female characters introduced in the second book that I felt like they kind of resolved that issue that I had with this one. However, that wasn't enough for me, and I really did try. I got about 50% of the way through the audiobook, and I really was trying to continue on. I didn't really like the way the story was headed. I found a lot of issues with the main character is very unlikable, and he really doesn't get better. And there were different points of view in the second book, whereas this one only focused on our main character, Tao. So that was exciting, but I felt like the lion's share of characterization was focused on a main character that I absolutely hated, and then everyone else felt very surface level. So it's very hard to enjoy a book where you really feel like you only have one three-dimensional character and you just don't like that character. And then also, I just didn't like the way the story was heading. I didn't really enjoy, I just felt myself feeling like it was work picking up the book. And obviously, as someone who reads for pleasure, you never want that to happen, so I did decide to DNF it. I think this series is just not a fit for me, and I think I would pick up something by Evan Winter in the future because the writing style itself is really good. Evan Winter is definitely going to be, I feel like, a heavy hitter in the fantasy genre with the next couple of years. I wish all the best for this series, and I know a lot of people really thought, I will say, the second book, a lot of things that I had issues with the first book were resolved, but not enough for me to continue the series. So if you were on the fence, I would say maybe give the second book a try. But just ultimately, this isn't a series that I really want to prioritize and really want to continue. So that's a bummer, but I don't know. Never say never. I mean, maybe I will hear really wonderful things about the third and fourth books in the series. I don't think, because I did kind of look up the end of the second book to see if it was going where I thought it was going, and I don't think I'll continue with the series, but never say never. So this is one that I might come back to one day, but just for me right now, this is not a good fit of a series for me. The next book that I read is Girl A by Abigail Dean, and it's marketed as a thriller, at least it was on Book of the Month. I disagree with that. I don't think it has the right pacing to be a thriller, but I did enjoy reading this. Just note going in, it's not really a thriller. There's not like really any thrilling elements because you know what happens in the story, but this is a dual timeline story. About one timeline, there is a girl named Girl A, and she and her siblings are being very heavily abused by their parents, and where they're like shackled to walls and everything. So trigger warnings for this book. It is very dark. It talks about a lot of dark things, so know that going into the book. But she does, with her siblings, help kind of plan an escape out of the situation, and she manages to escape and get help for her and her siblings. And then the second timeline is following Girl A and her siblings as they are adults. As adults, their last remaining parent has passed away in prison, so they inherit this house that they were kept captive in for so many years, and they are very estranged. They don't really talk to each other anymore, but they do kind of have to come together and figure out what they want to do with this house and with this legacy that they were kind of given back, and dealing with all of the uncomfortable feelings and memories and trauma that came with that house for them and figuring out what to do with it. So this is very dark. Trigger warnings for suicide, suicidal ideation, self-harm, abuse, both physical and mental, very severe abuse, death of children through abuse and neglect, and just it's a very dark book. So know that going in. And the reason why I say this isn't a thriller is because it kind of sounds like a thriller from the synopsis, but if you go into it, the very first chapter is this child, this girl A, and she escapes this situation. So you know from the very first chapter, they escape and the kids are taken out of the situation, and then you're taken to the modern day, which is where you spend, I would say, the majority, the bulk of the action of the plot is in modern day. So you know that these kids have escaped and their parents, one of them has died and one of them has gone to jail for the rest of their life because of the things that happened to the kids. So really, this book is less of a kind of thrilling mystery, like are they going to get out of this situation, because you know that's happened, and then in the rest of the child part of the story you're just kind of exploring how they went from kind of a normal family to this. So there's not a lot of mystery, so know that going in. It is very character driven, it is very dark and exploring trauma and just how deeply something like this would impact the rest of your life, no matter how far you try and like distance yourself from it. So it really does focus on the characters and how each of them kind of dealt with this and tried to move on in different ways. That's really the story here. It's less about the actual trauma, even though it is described, but it's more about moving on from that and how that kind of creates a ripple effect in people's lives. So I did really enjoy this. This is the author's first book, and I would be interested in picking up more by this author. I will say this did kind of start out a little bit slowly, not so much where I felt like I wanted to DNF it or anything like that, but it is very, very slow at the beginning. And then the second half I felt like is paced a whole lot better and makes more sense. And I personally didn't have any issues following the timelines. This is written in a way where I think there are only about 5 chapters in this whole entire book, but the chapters you'll have the present day timeline, and then in the next paragraph there's a line break and then it'll go back in time. So if you really hate, I wouldn't recommend this as an audiobook for that reason. I feel like that would get confusing, but it's easy enough to tell just based on formatting when we're changing timelines, but it never actually says like before or after. So there is like a little bit of adjustment when you just switch like that, but I thought this was very easy to follow, at least easier than other books that have tried that same sort of kind of merging of timelines, how you switch back and forth without chapters marking where that is. So yeah, this is very, very dark, but I did really enjoy it. And while there are a bunch of really dark things like talked about in here, I really don't think that this was exploitive of that in any way. And I do know that the author, this is her first book, but she was a lawyer, so I have to imagine that potentially some of this that was discussed in here, maybe she got inspiration from her real life job. So yeah, would recommend this. Just, you know, be mindful. This is a very dark, potentially triggering book. Definitely look up more extensive trigger warnings than what I listed here, but I did enjoy reading this one. The next book we're going to talk about is Persephone Station by Stina, Leicht, and this was one that I was under the impression it was going to be the first book in like a series. It's not. I think it's a standalone, so that's kind of a bummer. And honestly, I was a little bit let down by this book in general, but I did enjoy the ride. I just felt like the pacing in this one was a little bit weird. So this is a space opera standalone about a planet named Persephone Station, and on this planet there is a group of indigenous, I mean aliens, they're not human, but they are indigenous to this planet. They are being forced out by a human corporation, and they have to enlist the help of a ragtag team of kind of vigilante sort of ex-soldiers to help them save their home from this corporation. This was one of my most anticipated books of the year. I was really looking forward to it. I still think this is one of the most gorgeous covers of the year. I wish this would have been a series. I was really enjoying myself. I felt like the first half of this book was a whole lot stronger than the second half, and that's only because there is so much in here. There's so much action in here that sometimes gets glossed over to fit all within one book. This definitely could have been a duology at least. So I wish that would have happened, because the biggest thing for me was it started off slow. I don't mind a slower story. I enjoy a character-driven story, but it almost started off too slow, where there's a huge action scene at the end and then the conclusion just felt very, very rushed to me. So I really do wish, and I did feel like there were some big picture things talked about in here that wrapped up very neatly. And not just neatly, but like very fast and conveniently. Like, I think the big action that we're building up to for the whole book only takes place in 2 chapters. So that was a little disappointing. I did enjoy the writing style. It was like a little strange to get into, but I am newer to the science fiction genre, so I don't know if that might have been it. This book was a whole lot of fun to read. The characters were fun, so I would really be interested in picking up more from this author, especially if they like would expand the work in this universe that they've created. One thing that I do think is really cool to mention that I know a lot of people are, you know, in the market for, it's definitely one of the reasons why I prioritize newer sci-fi to older sci-fi, is that this is a futuristic world without homophobia, sexism, racism. Like, there are so many wonderfully diverse characters in here, and it's not even brought up as part of the plot or part of the conflict. They're just there, they're living their lives. It's not even relevant to the story. They're just characters, and they're just wonderfully diverse characters that are just there. So I really appreciate that. So I mean, if you are looking for a sci-fi with those elements, this is very, very diverse in all sorts of ways, and it's not like a part of the conflict or the plot. So really enjoyed that, and like the normalization of that is something that is very important. So that was a really big selling point on this book, and I did really enjoy that. It's always really nice just reading characters where their identity is not a part of their conflict, it's just another part of them. And then I did enjoy the writing style. Again, like I said, this would have been, I feel like the bigger picture story would have been better suited to a duology or even a trilogy, because I felt like it was very rushed in here, which ultimately was why I was a little bit disappointed in this. But overall, I did have a really fun time reading this, and I would like to read more from this author. And then the last book that I'm going to be talking about for my wrap-up is Last Night at the Telegraph Club by Malinda Lo, and this was a book that is very out of my comfort zone just in terms of genre. It is YA historical fiction, and there aren't like any fantasy elements or anything like that. It is a contemporary romance as well, so a lot of genres that I don't normally pick up, but I did really enjoy this one, and I would highly recommend the audiobook. The audiobook is narrated by Emily Wu Zeller, and she is one of my favorite audiobook narrators. She's the narrator for the Poppy War series, and I highly recommend it because this book is set in the 1940s and 50s San Francisco, following a Chinese American family who have to deal with repercussions from World War II and the racism towards Asian Americans, and just growing up differently in a different country than where your ancestry is from, the struggles that are from that, being constantly viewed as an outsider, and then focusing primarily on the daughter of this family, Lily, who is not only dealing with these things that her family is dealing with, and the US government potentially taking her father's well-deserved and earned citizenship away from him, but she's also dealing with some feelings that good Chinese daughters don't really feel, and she is falling in love with one of her female classmates, and so has to explore quite a few different things trying to find her place in the world. The reason why I think the audiobook narration is wonderful is because this is a story that focuses so heavily on culture, really diving into different people in the same family who come from different backgrounds, who have very different opinions on things, where we have Lily's father was very rich in China. His family is very rich. He just originally comes to the United States for an education and then wants to come back, and then World War II prevents that. Lily's mother is from a poorer family who is raised in the San Francisco area, so she's never been to China, but she still feels like that war between whether or not she's really American or Chinese or both. And then Lily is very much disconnected in a lot of ways. She knows how to speak Mandarin, she's fluent in English, she gets a lot of microaggressions because she sounds like an American an American, even though she is Chinese. So I just feel like the audiobook narration does such a wonderful job of the subtle nuances of language, and language is such an important factor in this audiobook. And I don't speak Chinese, and I think actually the book itself has Chinese characters in it, which is really cool because multiple people in this book are bilingual and speak different languages interchangeably. So being able to hear that was really immersive, and it was so well done. And what I really liked about this book too is that there's an afterword explaining a lot of context at the time. I will say I know a lot about history. I do know a good amount of this time period, but if you are kind of worried about going into this one not knowing a lot about it, there is like a timeline. It does focus on the family's timeline, but it also talks about other things in like American policies and American politics during the time, so you never feel lost in the time period, and the book does a great job of explaining those things that you need to understand the context of what is happening. So I thought that was really well done. Really fascinating. It's very heartbreaking. I mean, trigger warnings for homophobia. It is the 1950s, so you know there is also a lot of racism going on and a lot of slurs used in here for a variety of different people. So tread lightly. Obviously it is very heartbreaking to read, and I do think especially, I mean, you know, I think this is very relevant for what is going on right now, right? With hate crimes for Asian Americans and just Asians in general in the United States and abroad as well, with how racists are, you know, blaming them for COVID and everything. This book is hard to read at times, intentionally so. So I think if you would be bothered by any sort of slur towards people of Asian descent or any sort of slur towards the queer community, I would hesitate going into this one. Maybe look up trigger warnings, because I mean, it's set in the 1950s. It doesn't shy away from that. The main character does experience a lot of self-doubt and kind of hatred for parts of herself that she is like hoping that she can change, but ultimately can't. So this is very heartbreaking. It's very timeful. And honestly, I know that's like, it's not the point of this book, but it's honestly fucking ridiculous reading some of these things and some of these prejudices that you read what people go through, and then you're like, okay, well that was in the 1950s, we're in a better time, and then, you know, we're still in a society where people are beating up people on the street for being Asian. My partner and people that I love still experience racist microaggressions weekly, constantly. So it does kind of suck reading this and seeing society is better, but at the same time it's not. And I think books like this are a great way of kind of just introducing kids. Not kids, it's YA, it's not like middle grade, but I do think this is a book for younger readers to introduce them to things and really have those discussions and to talk about injustices and really experience them and realize that these things are still very much issues. And yeah, I thought this book was very impactful, and slight spoilers for the ending, not in terms of content, but just in terms of vibe at the end of this. Slight spoilers again. This book ends very realistically. I feel like with the demographic, because I do feel like it does deal with darker content, but the writing style is so accessible and just the characters are a little on the younger end that it does read a little bit young, which I don't have a problem with. But you know, I do feel like there is a tendency, I think we're moving away from that now, but just you want a happy ending, and realistically, I mean, it's not a tragic ending, but it's a realistic ending for the time. So know that going in there. It's very deep. It is very beautiful and moving and a wonderfully written book, but it is very hard to read at times, and I can't imagine being both of those identities and having to read this book right now. I think it would be a little bit triggering because it does kind of go into how different minorities are sometimes pitted against each other. Like Lily she's thinking she is a lesbian and she is also Chinese, and even in queer safe spaces at the time, she's still experiencing both macro and microaggressions towards herself because of her skin color and how she is Chinese and not white. So I think that's uniquely hard as well, where even in safe spaces where people should feel and like understand what it's like to be discriminated against, you still experience that discrimination if you have another minority as well. So tough book. important book. Definitely recommend it. I do think this is geared more towards the main character is a senior in high school, and I would say it's perfect reading for about that time. It does kind of go into her family members at different parts. I think a couple of different family members get like a chapter kind of explaining their own point of view, but it does mostly follow a young teen cast, so would recommend. It was a really immersive read, and again, the audiobook is really excellently done. So there you have it. That is all the books that I read in the month of February. Like I mentioned, my mid-month wrap-up will be down below as well, so you can check out some more in-depth book reviews, but that is going to be it for me. If you liked this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, leave a comment down below, subscribe for more content from me. Stay safe, stay spooky, and I'll see y'all on the other side. Bye!